So sorry about this, everybody. The barriers that we've overcome as we started out our project. Originally, we started by talking to all the key local experts who were able to advocate for funding and support within their own organisations on our behalf. We recruited a few supportive landowners as early adopters to demonstrate success to their peers. And we'd signed up a wide range of stakeholders as partners, including farming and shooting interests, major landowners, as well as local and national government agencies and various conservation charities. I researched the existing partnerships for lessons that they had already learnt and best practice in our work. We've also been trialling new techniques adapted to our local habitats. We have 6 initial sites that we agreed as priorities to target for restoration projects, which have all now been completed, and we set a target to restore 2,020 hectares by 2020. Next slide, please. So the barriers that we still face, apart from practical challenges of working over winter on remote hilltops like the one in this picture, we have nationwide a shortage of experienced staff in our work because it's quite specialised, and that restricts everyone's ability to scale up their work anymore at present. Funding for peat partnerships is quite limited and short term, so that's restricting their capacity. Funding for restoration works is largely from the government, and the amounts that they've pledged are nowhere near enough yet to tackle the 2 million hectare targets that the UK peatland strategy has adopted. Large private estates own most of our uplands, so ultimately they will decide whether or not work can actually go ahead. Next slide, please. So how could it be made easier to do what we do? Apprenticeships and student placements would be great for training the conservationists of the future. If we are to attract increased funding for what I recognise is quite an obscure cause to most people, then awareness raising is going to be really vital. We need long-term incentive schemes for peatland owners who could face loss of income from permanently turning land back into bogs. Upland volunteering projects would increase our capacity, as we don't have enough time to properly manage volunteer groups at the moment. Nature recovery networks are an idea that were proposed by the Wildlife Trust that seems to be being taken up by government now. By mapping all our key remaining habitats and identifying the opportunities to expand and link them, then local and central government will have a tool to plan for bringing wildlife back into our cities and our countryside. Next slide, please. So the potential benefits for the economy and jobs and skills from rolling out our work more widely. Now, hill farms can access agri-environment payments if they sign up to schemes which require habitat management. We generate work for skilled agricultural contractors and the other businesses who service them, from machinery to plant and seed suppliers, fencing contractors, and the teams of people needed to install dams and plant out cotton grass and bog mosses, as you can see being done here in this picture. Professionals like myself would be employed to plan and oversee all the contracts. And involving students allows them to train in key skills for the future work in what we think is going to be a growing sector for environmental management. Next slide, please. The expected co-benefits of our work. I suppose biodiversity was really our original reason for restoring peatlands as a wildlife trust. Cumbria has some rare wetland habitats and species that have been largely lost elsewhere. Even the blanket bog habitats that cover much of the British uplands are actually very rare in a global context. Since we started our project, there's been more and more evidence for the importance of peatlands for regulating water quality and for mitigating the effects of floods on communities that live downstream. And government funding has been reflecting that. More recently, the climate change agenda has taken precedence, and there has been recognition that peatland restoration is a very cost-effective way to address all of these issues at once. Next slide, please. So move on to some of the unexpected co-benefits for us that we've discovered. Now, for us, there's a challenge in showing people what we do, because most of the work is underground and becomes invisible if we're actually successful in restoring a site. This is encouraging nature conservationists to be more creative. And some of them are working with artists to engage with local communities. I've realised that stories about heritage tend to engage people more than the science does. There are actually ancient forests and treasures and even dead bodies preserved forever in peat bogs. And our ancestors were mostly digging up peat for fuel, even in areas that are now within the cities. Our work was going on largely unseen in the remotest parts of the county for several years, but by linking it to flooding and water quality, there's now a link directly to the cities at the other end of the river catchments. Climate change has also brought potential links to the sustainability agenda and to activist groups. Now, for volunteers and benefits, every person has their individual story really, and there are a whole range of ways in which they benefit from coming to help us, from their physical and mental health, gaining work experience, being able to share their skills with us. This photo here was taken during a week-long volunteering event that I ran a few years back, where we measured the size and the extent of erosion gullies in the Lake District. We had some retired engineers who were delighted to advise us on how to construct our dams properly, peatland scientists who wanted to get out of their lab back into nature, a recent immigrant with excellent qualifications and experience in environmental management who was having to work in an unskilled job in the city centre. I can hardly imagine really how important it probably was for him to come out and meet some fellow conservationists and be out in the countryside. We had unemployed young people who were very lacking in confidence and direction in their lives before they came out. Next slide, please. I thought I would just wrap up with one final take-home message, which is a fact, I suppose, rather than a message. 37% of the emissions reductions needed to meet the UK's Paris climate targets by 2030 could be achieved by managing our habitats with wildlife in mind. Quite an incredible figure, really. We already know how to do this. It's not an imaginary technology that we're hoping to rely on. It's stuff that we should be doing already. 37%. This short document that you can see on the screens here, produced by the Wildlife Trust, I thoroughly recommend this. It lists all the different projects that you could consider, as well as peatlands, to tackle the climate crisis, from gardens and allotments to coastal salt marshes to forests to peatlands. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks for keeping to time. So we're going to take a few questions now. The first one, I would like to know how we can stop peat extraction in Somerset, where the County Council gives licences for the extraction, then we can restore them.
Well, there has been over the years several peat extraction companies who have stopped extracting in the north of England. And I think a lot of that has been to do with local campaigning, really. There's been, well, certainly in Lancashire, it was the Wildlife Trust who led a campaign of local people against the peat extraction. Not all their members involved, but generally, in my experience, local and national governments seem to have policies against this now, and I would have thought that they might well be interested in protecting sites as well. So really, I suppose it's I suppose you start with it with awareness raising and try to talk to people who have influence, because the local authorities are the ones who are going to be licensing this, and I would have thought most of them probably have sustainability agendas which surely should be preventing them from allowing things like this to go ahead. One of the issues in a site in the north of England was that obviously the peat, potentially, to the people who have a license to extract it, is a valuable resource, and I think sometimes they end up being given large payouts in order to stop doing it. And I suspect that might be a stumbling block for a lot of local authorities, unless they have the money to do that. But certainly, I think campaigning has to be the way to start with. I don't know about the site in particular, whether this is already going ahead, but yes, there should be a national campaign starting soon, I hope, actually, in terms of trying to persuade people not to use peat, but stopping people digging it is obviously the first thing to start.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anthony?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Somebody's asking whether COVID has affected your ability to use volunteers for the work.
Yes, it has. We had a big program of work planned for this summer, trying to get a lot more volunteers involved. I suppose we've had an ongoing problem with trying to get enough people to come out and volunteer on very remote sites that are a long way from where anybody lives. We had a big program of events lined up for this summer, and anything that involved gathering people for events, whether it was volunteering or public talks and other events, all our program got cancelled over the summer and still hasn't been resurrected yet. We are starting to try and be careful and get volunteering on a smaller, more personal scale. So we're asking small groups of people to come out and volunteer, and targeting people who were on our volunteer list and asking them what they would be comfortable with doing. But we aren't able to publicly advertise events, as it were.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. So a question here: what skills are required from volunteers?
Well, in terms of knowledge, nothing really. Everything. And I suppose the one thing that we do need in terms of coming to volunteer in the uplands is someone with enough physical fitness that they can spend a day outside and walk to some of the sites that we work on are an hour or two's walk from the road. So I suppose in terms of advertising volunteers, we are specifically looking to target perhaps groups of more active people and thinking about targeting groups of people who come to the countryside anyway, perhaps for kind of outdoor pursuits and adventure activities with good levels of fitness, who perhaps encouraging them to not think of it as a playground, but actually somewhere that needs caring for.
Okay.
Thanks, Simon. Are you aware of any research you could share about the impacts of climate change on peatlands?
Oh goodness, there's
likely to be affected.
There's a whole host of stuff out there. I would recommend going to the IUCN UK Peatland Programme website. They act as a bit of a hub for people like myself and scientists and people in government, actually, all coming together to try and take action on peatlands in the UK. So they have had a big commission of inquiry looking at all the scientific evidence on a whole range of issues and bringing it all together and trying to put it out in accessible form. So yes, the IUCN UK Peatland Programme, check them out.
Okay.
Thank you. Are you aware of any research on the impacts of climate change on peatlands, for example, changing rainfall patterns?
Okay, so how the climate is actually affecting the peatlands. Yes, there's Again, I think I would direct people to that same website to look for evidence. I'm afraid I don't have any links to specific pieces of research on the tip of my tongue, but I do have anecdotal evidence, certainly, that from my personal experience, I can see that the changes that are happening to our climate are exactly the sort of things that are causing problems with erosion of peatlands. If they dry out in the summer, then we get cracking of the peat soils, and then if those cracks are then exposed to large amounts of water after a flood event, water washes into those cracks and expands them, and we end up with huge holes in the ground. So those two conditions, summer droughts and winter floods, are the sort of changes that we're actually seeing in the climate, certainly in the north of Britain. We're seeing more storm events and we're seeing more drought events. So the combination of those two is rather worrying.
And maybe just related to that, someone was asking how gullies form, whether it's increased rainfall, global warming, or old peat cutting.
Probably all of those, I would say. The answer to every question in ecology is it's not that simple. There's a whole host of factors all working at the same time. Definitely, there is a vast scale of peat cutting happening. Most of it, I think, even people like myself who work in this area all the time don't really appreciate what was going on. In many of our sites, probably 50% of the peat soil has already been removed hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before any of us remember. And if you have a peat, I guess peat forms as a kind of relatively flat layer in a waterlogged area. If you then take a great big chunk out of that, it instantly drains all of the surrounding peat and destabilizes it. And that kind of causes erosion along the edges and cracking. And then these erosion gullies tend to fan out from the areas of peat cutting, I find, and also from where the small ad hoc drains were put into the ground to do peat cutting to help them to move around. Those drains will probably start washing out and turning into gullies over the centuries. So that's happening. There's also where drainage has happened and the ground is drying and cracking. Water is going down underground into cracks, and these are expanding and expanding, because the only part of a peat bog that's solid really is the turf on the surface. Once the water starts breaks through that into all the soft, squidgy peat underneath, it can erode very rapidly. So we find what we call peat pipes, big erosion channels under the ground where the erosion is happening. They're invisible until they become so big that sinkholes start opening up, and you find a 2 or 3 meter drop down into a soggy hole with water running along the bottom. And those keep expanding until eventually the turf above them collapses and you end up with a gully.
Thank you very much, Simon, for answering all of those questions.